Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Step into a room in the summer of 1908.
Right, just a small room.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You are looking at a space holding just 34 men. They have no official badges. They carry no federally issued weapons. And, well, their entire operation is running on borrowed money because the United States Congress actively refuses to fund them.
Which is such a stark contrast to what we see today.
It really is. I mean, step out of that room and look at the modern reality. Today, we're analyzing a sprawling 38,000-strong global intelligence and law enforcement apparatus. And they're operating with an annual budget exceeding $9 billion.
$9 billion. Yeah, the scale is just massive now.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how power, law, and security evolved in the United States over the last century, you really have to trace the lifeblood of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
You do.
In this deep dive, we are going to comprehensively explore the history of the FBI. We are looking at how it built its structure, how its internal culture formed, and how it navigated deep political waters over more than 100 years.
It is a really profound institutional arc. The organization we see today, it didn't emerge fully formed at all.
No, it took a long time.
Right. It constantly had to build and rebuild itself in response to national crises. At every step, the agency was forced to navigate this severe internal battle over its own identity. Like, were they police officers, were they spies, or were they something entirely different?
Let us start before the agency even existed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At this point, the United States had no general-purpose federal investigative agency.
Not at all.
If you broke a federal law, the government literally had to borrow Secret Service agents from the Treasury Department to look into it. Congress was deeply resistant to creating a centralized federal police force.
Yeah, and that resistance was rooted in a very specific historical anxiety. Lawmakers looked across the Atlantic at European nations and saw entities like the Tsarist secret police in Russia.
Right, they saw the abuses.
Exactly. The fundamental fear was that a federal police force in America would inevitably become a political weapon, used to silence dissent. Furthermore, the country was still deeply tied to the concept of localized power.
Which makes sense for the time.
It does. The prevailing belief was that local sheriffs and state authorities were totally sufficient to handle crime.
But the reality of a rapidly industrializing nation was proving that localized system completely inadequate. I mean, the country was expanding, railroads were connecting the coasts, and criminals were taking advantage of the new mobility.
Right, they could just hop on a train.
Exactly. A local sheriff simply could not investigate a syndicate operating across 3 different state lines. The breaking point really seemed to be the massive land fraud cases, particularly the Oregon land fraud scandal.
The Oregon land fraud is a perfect example of why the federal government realized it was functionally paralyzed. Syndicates were exploiting the Timber and Stone Act of 1878.
How were they doing that?
Well, they were paying hundreds of transient workers these small fees to file claims on highly valuable public timberlands and then transferring those titles to massive lumber corporations.
So they were essentially laundering the land.
Yes, exactly. This was federal land being stolen on a monumental scale. Local authorities were often either complicit in the schemes or just completely outmatched by the wealth of the syndicates.
So the feds had to step in.
They wanted to, but the Department of Justice realized it possessed federal laws to prosecute these crimes, but zero investigative capacity to gather the evidence required for court.
It was like trying to build a city fire department while the city council is terrified of water damage.
That is a great way to put it.
The federal government recognized a blazing fire interstate crime and corporate monopolies, but the legislature was terrified of a federal police force. So the executive branch just decided to build the fire department in secret.
They really did. President Theodore Roosevelt and his Attorney General Charles Bonaparte effectively bypassed Congress.
How do they manage that without funding?
They utilized a very creative bureaucratic maneuver. When Congress passed a law in 1908 explicitly forbidding the Justice Department from borrowing Secret Service agents anymore, Bonaparte took Department of Justice expense funds and simply hired his own investigators.
Just unilaterally.
Right. On July 26, 1908, he formally created the Bureau of Investigation, or the BOI, placing a man named Stanley Finch in charge of this small ad hoc unit.
And the fears that Congress had about federal overreach were validated almost instantly. Within 2 years, by 1910, the mandate of these investigators drifted away from corporate monopolies and land fraud and went straight into policing public morality.
Yeah, that happened fast.
The BOI began enforcing the Mann Act, which is also known as the White Slave Traffic Act,
The enforcement of the Mann Act required federal investigators to heavily monitor houses of prostitution and track the movement of individuals across state lines.
which means they were watching people's private lives.
Exactly. The mechanism of this enforcement meant the Bureau was suddenly compiling dossier on the private, moral behaviors of citizens. The scope of their authority was widening rapidly, and they had absolutely no clear statutory boundaries outlining what they could and could not do.
That expanding mandate accelerated dramatically as the United States entered and exited World War I. The target shifted from public morality to political ideology, culminating in the Palmer raids.
The Palmer raids were huge.
Massive. These raids were a coordinated dragnet operation targeting alien radicals, anarchists, and suspected communists.
The context here is crucial to understanding the Bureau's actions. In 1919, there was a series of severe anarchist bombings across the country.
Right, people were legitimately scared.
They were. Mail bombs were sent to prominent politicians and capitalists, and a bomb was even detonated at the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer himself. In response, Palmer authorized the Bureau to act.
So they went on the offensive.
Across 33 cities, federal agents rounded up tens of thousands of individuals.
But the mechanics of these raids were incredibly crude. The sources indicate that the vast majority of these arrests were conducted without warrants.
Right, they just bypassed the courts entirely.
Agents were kicking down doors of union halls and social clubs, sweeping up anyone inside and holding them incommunicado. And supervising this massive intelligence gathering operation was a 24-year-old Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover.
What's fascinating here is how the Palmer raids functioned as the foundational friction point between civil liberties and national security in the modern American era.
How so?
Well, because the Bureau was born as an ad hoc agency without a strict legislative charter, there were no built-in guardrails. This environment established an organizational DNA that prioritized the immediate perceived security of the state over the constitutional rights of individuals.
They felt the ends justified the means.
Precisely. The belief was that the threat was so existential that the normal rules of due process could be temporarily suspended.
But the public backlash to that suspension of rules was severe. The Palmer raids, combined with subsequent scandals under Director William J. Burns in the early 1920s, completely eroded the agency's credibility.
It was a very low point for them.
During the Teapot Dome affair, the Bureau was effectively used as a private detective agency to dig up dirt on political opponents of the administration. By 1924, the Bureau was viewed as corrupt, deeply politicized, and untrustworthy.
The institution was facing an existential crisis. The new Attorney General, Harlan Fiskstone, realized the Bureau needed a total structural overhaul just to survive.
So he brings in Hoover.
Right. In 1924, he appointed J. Edgar Hoover to take over as director. Hoover was only 29 years old, and his mandate was to clean house and restore public legitimacy.
Hoover approached this like a corporate restructuring. He immediately fired the political patronage hires. He established rigid professional standards, requiring new agents to pass rigorous civil service exams.
He really wanted to professionalize the force.
He did. He instituted a policy that the Bureau would primarily hire lawyers and accountants.
Why?
Why lawyers and accountants specifically?
Because Hoover recognized that the credibility of an investigative agency rests entirely on its ability to present unassailable evidence in a courtroom.
And lawyers know how to do that?
Exactly. Lawyers understood the strict rules of evidence, the necessity of chain of custody, and how to testify without having a case thrown out on a procedural technicality.
And what about the accountants?
Accountants were hired because Hoover understood that taking down large criminal syndicates or corrupt corporations required following complex financial trails. He was shifting the culture from heavy-handed enforcers to meticulous, white-collar professionals.
He also heavily emphasized the integration of science into law enforcement. In 1924, Hoover established the National Fingerprint Repository.
Which was a massive undertaking.
It was. The mechanism of centralizing fingerprints was a logistical revolution. Prior to this, police departments used fragmented systems or relied on the outdated Bertillon system of physical body measurements, which was notoriously flawed.
Right, measuring arm lengths and skull sizes.
Exactly. By consolidating millions of fingerprint cards into a single, searchable federal database using the Henry classification system, the Bureau became an indispensable resource for every local police department in the country.
The speed of it changed everything. If a sheriff in Texas arrested a drifter, they could mail the prints to Washington and know within days if the man was a fugitive from New York.
And he expanded on that scientific foundation in 1932 by founding the FBI laboratory. They began applying forensic science, analyzing bullet striations, examining soil samples, and conducting handwriting analysis to federal investigations.
They were really pioneering these techniques.
Structurally, the agency was reorganized into the Division of Investigation in 1933, and then finally officially renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1935.
And this institutional building occurred exactly as the Great Depression was ravaging the country.
Which created a whole new set of problems.
It did. The economic collapse created a fertile environment for highly mobile, heavily armed interstate gangs. Criminals were using the newly built highway systems and fast automobiles to rob banks in one state and cross the border into another before local police could even mobilize.
The local authorities were entirely outgunned. The public was terrified, and the FBI stepped into the void, declaring a war on crime. The Bureau began relentlessly pursuing individuals they branded as public enemies.
Those pursuits became legendary.
The sources provide vivid details of these pursuits. In July 1934, agents fatally shot John Dillinger outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago.
And that was heavily reliant on an informant.
Yes, this operation only succeeded because the Bureau utilized an informant, Anna Sage, who tipped them off to his location. That same year, agents tracked down and killed Charles Pretty Boy Floyd in an Ohio field and engaged in a massive, fatal shootout with Babyface Nelson.
Hoover leveraged these highly publicized kinetic operations to craft a very specific narrative. He recognized that to secure the permanent future of the Bureau, he needed more than just quiet competence. He needed cultural dominance.
So what does this all mean for the agency's evolution? It means Hoover executed a masterclass in public relations. He took his meticulous, rule-following accountants and lawyers and manufactured an American archetype, the G-Man, short for government man.
The sharp suits, the fedoras.
Exactly. The G-Man was presented as the ultimate incorruptible force, a sharp-suited, fast-shooting intellectual who always got his man. The American public, deeply disillusioned by the corruption of Prohibition and the despair of the Depression, embraced this narrative entirely.
And that cultural embrace translated directly into tangible legislative power. Congress responds to public sentiment.
So they gave the FBI more authority.
They did. Following these high-profile captures, Congress passed the 1932 Federal Kidnapping Act, heavily expanding federal jurisdiction. More importantly, they passed comprehensive crime bills in 1934.
What did those bills do?
These bills fundamentally altered the Bureau by finally granting FBI agents the statutory power to make arrests and to carry firearms. The success of the war on crime permanently cemented the FBI's role as the premier institutionalized law enforcement agency in the nation.
But the nature of the threats facing the nation was about to shift radically. As the 1940s arrived, the onset of World War II forced the FBI to pivot away from domestic bank robbers and focus intensely on national security and counterintelligence.
Right, the mission changed overnight. The mandate shifted to identifying saboteurs and managing the threat of foreign nationals within the borders.
And the mechanism for this involved the FBI compiling extensive dossiers known as the ABC lists. Let us examine the mechanics of those lists because they had profound consequences. How did the Bureau categorize these individuals?
Well, the FBI categorized suspected dangerous aliens based on perceived threat levels. The A list contained leaders of cultural or political organizations who the Bureau believed would immediately assist an enemy invasion.
Okay, and the B list?
The B list contained individuals considered slightly less dangerous, perhaps those who donated to certain foreign causes.
And the C list?
The C list was the broadest, capturing individuals who simply expressed sympathies or held memberships in affiliated groups. When the war began, these lists were utilized by the government to quickly detain thousands of German, Italian, and Japanese nationals.
That is a massive sweep.
It was. Crucially, this intelligence gathering deeply involved the FBI in the initial stages of the Japanese-American internment.
The Bureau was operating on a scale it had never seen before. And as World War II ended and the Cold War began, that massive surveillance apparatus was retooled to combat the spread of communism.
The executive branch was demanding total domestic security.
Right. Executive Order 9835, issued in 1947, mandated stringent loyalty checks for all federal government workers.
To execute that order, the FBI was required to screen over 2 million federal employees.
Over 2 million.
Yes, searching for any signs of subversive affiliations or communist sympathies. And at the same time, the Bureau was simultaneously engaging in highly classified counterespionage operations to identify Soviet intelligence networks operating within the United States.
The sources highlight a specific, highly sensitive operation known as the Venona Project. The details here are fascinating. How exactly was the FBI identifying these deep cover spies?
The Venona project was a monumental cryptanalysis effort. Soviet intelligence utilized a system called a one-time pad for their encrypted cables.
And those are usually unbreakable, right?
Theoretically, yes. A one-time pad is completely unbreakable because the key is random and only used once. However, during the intense pressures of World War II, Soviet cipher clerks occasionally made the logistical error of reusing the same pads.
So they slipped up.
They did. American cryptanalysts working alongside the FBI painstakingly analyzed decades of intercepted cable traffic, utilizing complex mathematics to find the overlapping patterns.
They were essentially working a massive global puzzle, searching for a single repeated code that would crack the cipher.
Exactly. And once they found those vulnerabilities, they were able to decrypt portions of the cables. This intelligence proved crucial in identifying major Soviet spies, including those involved in the Atom spy case, who had successfully stolen classified information regarding the American nuclear weapons program.
Wait, I need to pause here and look at the structure of the agency itself. I find it difficult to reconcile these two eras.
How so?
Well, they spent a decade training agents to be accountants who could audit bank ledgers, or field operatives who could engage in shootouts with mobsters. How does the management simply snap their fingers and turn those same men into counterintelligence officers hunting deep-cover Soviet operatives? The required skill sets seem completely different.
It is a brilliant question, and it highlights a critical vulnerability in the FBI's operational philosophy. The leadership, primarily Hoover, fundamentally viewed threats through a singular lens.
Meaning he treated all threats the same.
Yes. He believed that domestic political dissent was inextricably intertwined with foreign subversion. Therefore, the Bureau simply applied the tactical mechanisms developed for fighting organized crime, widespread physical surveillance, the cultivation of informants, and the utilization of wiretaps to the realm of counterintelligence.
So they treated a foreign intelligence officer the same way they treated a bank robber.
In many ways, yes. But while the physical tactics transferred, the constitutional framework did not.
Because catching a robber is different from tracking a spy.
Exactly. Investigating a bank robbery involves pursuing a specific, defined criminal act. Counterintelligence involves investigating associations, ideologies, and potential future actions. Blurring the lines between legitimate foreign intelligence threats and domestic political beliefs created a dangerous environment where the Bureau began policing the thoughts and political affiliations of American citizens.
And that environment birthed an incredibly dark chapter in the agency's history. We're moving into the 1950s and 60s now.
Well, it's a very turbulent era.
As a reminder to everyone listening, our goal today is to impartially unpack the raw historical record to understand how the FBI's power evolved. The historical actions we are about to discuss regarding civil rights and political movements are highly controversial, and we are strictly examining the facts as detailed in the sources to understand the institutional mindset of the era.
Right. The friction between the Bureau's mandate to protect the state and the constitutional rights of the citizens reached a boiling point during this period. In 1956, the FBI officially launched COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program.
Initially, the stated goal of COINTELPRO was to disrupt and neutralize the Communist Party USA. But the parameters of the program steadily and aggressively expanded.
They cast a much wider net.
The Bureau began targeting the Ku Klux Klan, various groups within the New Left, and most prominently, the Civil Rights Movement.
The rationale the Bureau used to justify targeting civil rights leaders was rooted in that Cold War paranoia we just discussed.
They thought the Soviets were involved.
Yes. The FBI believed that because some individuals involved in the movement had past associations with communist organizations, the entire civil rights infrastructure was vulnerable to being co-opted by Soviet influence. Consequently, they heavily targeted organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC.
The sources detail heavy, sustained monitoring of Martin Luther King Jr., as well as figures crucial to his organization, such as Bayard Rustin, Stanley Levison, and Hunter Pitts Odell. But this was not just passive observation.
No, they were very active.
The FBI was not just watching, they were actively trying to destroy these organizations from the inside.
Yeah.
The mechanisms they used were invasive. The sources mention agents attending sound school. What exactly were these agents learning?
Sound School was a specialized, highly classified 3-week training course that taught agents the mechanics of physical intrusion and electronic surveillance. Agents were trained in lockpicking and safe-cracking.
So they were essentially learning how to break and enter.
Exactly. They learned how to surreptitiously cut into the wall of a home or office, plaster a listening device directly into the infrastructure, and seamlessly seal and paint over the wall so the occupants would never know they were being recorded.
These techniques facilitated what the Bureau referred to as black bag jobs.
Yeah.
These were essentially official, unauthorized burglaries.
They were completely outside the legal system.
Right. Agents would break into the offices of targeted political groups in the middle of the night to photograph membership lists, steal financial records, or plant bugs, all entirely outside the judicial warrant process.
And the intelligence gathered from these black bag jobs and wiretaps was weaponized. COINTELPRO was designed for psychological warfare. The FBI routinely sent forged correspondence to create paranoia and incite violence between rival political factions.
The sources mentioned a very specific, notorious example of this.
Yes, the 1964 anonymous suicide letter sent to Dr. King. The Bureau compiled a package of illicitly recorded audio tapes regarding King's private life and mailed them to him, accompanied by an anonymous letter.
And the letter threatened him.
It did. It threatened to expose the details to the press unless he took his own life before accepting the Nobel Peace Prize.
It functions exactly like an immune system suffering from a severe autoimmune disease. The agency's fundamental mandate was to protect the health and status quo of the nation. But that mandate became so warped by paranoia that the agency began aggressively attacking the very citizens who were trying to enact lawful, necessary social change. The white blood cells were destroying the healthy tissue.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to examine the systemic failure that allowed an autoimmune response of this magnitude to occur.
How does something like this go unchecked for so long?
Well, how did a federal agency operate a sprawling, illegal domestic disruption program for over a decade? The answer is a complete vacuum of congressional oversight. J. Edgar Hoover had consolidated immense power over a 50-year tenure. He maintained secret files detailing the private indiscretions of politicians, presidents, and powerful figures.
So he had leverage over everyone.
Exactly. Because of this leveraged power, lawmakers were terrified to challenge him. The Bureau functioned as an unchecked domestic intelligence apparatus because the checks and balances required by a democracy were functionally paralyzed by fear.
But the dam finally broke, and the veil of secrecy was pierced by an unlikely source. In 1971, it was not a congressional subpoena that exposed the Bureau, but a group of everyday citizens.
This is one of the most incredible moments in the agency's history.
A group calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI executed a break-in at a small resident FBI agency in Media, Pennsylvania.
The mechanics of this break-in were brilliant in their simplicity. The group chose the night of the historic Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier boxing match, knowing that the entire country, including law enforcement, would be distracted.
They used a boxing match as cover.
Right. They picked the lock, stole hundreds of classified files, and systematically mailed them to major newspapers. Those stolen documents contained the word COINTELPRO and exposed the existence of the program to the world.
The exposure sent shockwaves through the country. Just a year later, in 1972, J. Edgar Hoover died in office at the age of 77.
End of an era.
The towering figure who had defined the agency for half a century was suddenly gone, right as the institution's darkest secrets were spilling into the public square.
The immediate aftermath was institutional chaos. Acting Director L. Patrick Gray was brought in, but he was quickly engulfed in the Watergate scandal.
Right. He didn't last long.
No, he eventually resigned in disgrace after admitting to destroying sensitive files related to the Nixon administration. The public trust that Hoover had so carefully manufactured in the 1930s evaporated entirely. Congress realized it could no longer turn a blind eye.
In 1975, the Senate convened the Church Committee. This committee conducted exhaustive hearings that laid bare the full, terrifying extent of the Bureau's abuses over the previous decades.
They put everything out in the open.
They detailed the thousands of warrantless wiretaps, the execution of black bag jobs, the forged documents, and the systemic targeting of political figures and domestic movements. The agency was stripped down to the studs in the public eye.
To survive, the FBI required systemic structural reforms. The executive branch and Congress worked to build a new framework that would forcefully rein in the agency's unchecked power. In 1976, Attorney General Edward Levi issued a strict set of operational guidelines.
The Levi Guidelines introduced a crucial legal threshold, the requirement of articulable facts. Explain how this changed the day-to-day operations of an agent.
Prior to the Levi Guidelines, an agent could open a domestic security probe based on vague suspicions or simply because the Bureau disliked a group's political ideology.
They could just investigate anyone they wanted.
Basically, yes. But the new guidelines dictated that an agent could only open a full investigation if they possessed specific, articulable facts indicating that a federal crime had been or was about to be committed. It anchored the Bureau's investigative power back to the criminal code rather than political ideology.
Congress also intervened structurally. They enacted a strict, non-renewable 10-year term limit for the director of the FBI.
Which was a direct response to Hoover.
Exactly. The singular goal of this legislation was to ensure that no individual could ever again consolidate lifelong power and leverage it against the government the way Hoover had. Furthermore, in 1978, Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA.
FISA fundamentally altered how the Bureau conducted national security investigations. It established specialized secret courts.
So they needed a warrant now.
Yes. If the FBI wanted to wiretap a suspected foreign agent within the United States, they could no longer simply authorize it internally. They were required to present evidence to a federal judge in a classified setting and obtain a judicial warrant, finally inserting a measure of judicial oversight into the counterintelligence process.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The FBI had essentially hit the reset button. Under new directors like Clarence M. Kelly and William Webster, the Bureau was bleeding public trust. They desperately needed a way to prove their value to the American people and demonstrate that they were a professional, constitutionally compliant law enforcement agency.
They needed a unifying adversary. They needed a target that the public universally recognized as a dangerous threat, completely divorced from political ideology.
And who did they choose?
This institutional need led to a massive pivot back to their law enforcement roots. They set their sights on systematically dismantling the institution of organized crime.
Which is deeply ironic because historically under Hoover's tenure, the FBI was incredibly reluctant to even acknowledge the existence of a national structured mafia or La Cosa Nostra.
Hoover practically denied they existed for decades.
But the post-Hoover FBI decided to go to war with the five families.
And the mechanism that allowed them to wage this war was a piece of legislation passed in 1970, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, universally known as RICO.
I want to dig into the legal mechanics of this. Why did it take the FBI decades to systematically dismantle the mafia? And how did RICO actually work in a courtroom?
Well, before RICO, the legal framework simply did not exist to take down a complex, insulated enterprise. Law enforcement had to operate on a fragmented, reactive basis.
Meaning they could only go after individual crimes.
Right. Imagine trying to take down a massive corrupt corporation, but the law only allows you to arrest the entry-level employees who actually shred the documents. If a low-level mob soldier committed an extortion or a murder, the FBI could only charge that specific soldier. The boss, sitting in a social club issuing orders through layers of intermediaries, remained entirely legally insulated.
So ICO allowed prosecutors to pierce those layers of insulation.
Precisely. RICO changed the entire legal landscape. It allowed prosecutors to charge the entire criminal enterprise by proving a pattern of racketeering activity.
How do they prove a pattern?
The law required the government to prove that a defendant committed at least 2 predicate acts, such as extortion, gambling, or murder within a 10-year period in furtherance of the criminal enterprise. If the FBI could prove the structure of the mafia family existed and that the boss directed the enterprise, they could charge the boss for the murders committed by the soldiers on the street.
So they took down the hierarchy.
Yes. It transformed the FBI's approach from reacting to individual crimes to proactively mapping and dismantling entire structural hierarchies.
And to map those hierarchies, the FBI utilized incredibly dangerous, long-term undercover operations. The sources highlight the legendary work of Special Agent Joseph Pistone. He spent 6 years deeply infiltrated into the Bonanno crime family, posing as a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco.
The psychological toll of an operation like that is immense. An agent must completely abandon their identity, sever contact with their family, and live every single day knowing that a minor slip in their cover story means immediate execution.
It is hard to even comprehend that level of stress.
It is. But Pistone's unprecedented infiltration provided the Bureau with an intimate understanding of the Mafia's rules, structure, and internal politics. The intelligence he gathered directly led to over 200 federal indictments.
This deep undercover work, combined with thousands of hours of extensive wiretaps authorized under the new legal frameworks, culminated in a spectacular legal victory, the 1985 to 1986 Mafia Commission trial.
That trial was a turning point.
Utilizing ARCO, the FBI and federal prosecutors brought down the heads of New York's 5 families simultaneously. Bosses like Anthony Salerno and Carmine Persico were hit with 100-year sentences. The Bureau had effectively broken the back of the traditional mafia hierarchy.
It was a monumental operational success that accomplished exactly what the agency needed. It restored their reputation as the premier elite investigative force in the world. But an agency is never allowed to rest on its laurels. As the agency moved into the 1990s, the geopolitical landscape fractured once again.
The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Director Louis J. Freeh responded by reassigning hundreds of foreign counterintelligence agents to violent crime squads across the country.
They had to find a new focus.
Right. The Bureau also leaned heavily into the technological revolution of the decade. They pioneered the use of DNA testing in the FBI laboratory, revolutionizing violent crime investigations, and they began establishing squads to track the emerging threat of cyber intrusions.
And they achieved incredible investigative milestones during this period. Following the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, the FBI successfully investigated and prosecuted the perpetrators, navigating a complex web of international extremists.
And in 1996, they captured the elusive Unabomber, Theodore Kaczynski.
Yes.
The mechanism they used to catch Kaczynski is a fascinating application of science. They didn't catch him with fingerprints or a shootout. They used forensic linguistics.
Forensic linguistics was a relatively nascent field at the time. The Unabomber had mailed a massive anti-technology manifesto to major newspapers. FBI profilers and linguists painstakingly analyzed the text, looking for idiosyncratic phrasing.
Like linguistic fingerprints?
Exactly. They noticed he used specific antiquated terms like cool-headed logicians and inverted common proverbs, writing, "You can't eat your cake and have it too." When Kaczynski's brother read the published manifesto, he recognized those exact linguistic quirks from personal letters Theodore had sent him years prior.
So the brother turned him in based on his writing style.
Yes, he provided those letters to the FBI, and the linguistic match provided the probable cause needed for a search warrant.
It was a brilliant investigative work. But alongside these scientific triumphs, the 1990s were defined by catastrophic, highly publicized operational disasters. The decade severely tested the Bureau's tactical judgment and its ability to manage crises.
The defining failures of the era were the paramilitary sieges. In 1992, a standoff at Ruby Ridge in Idaho involving white separatist Randy Weaver resulted in the fatal shooting of Weaver's wife and son, as well as a deputy U.S. Marshal.
And Waco happened right after that.
Just a year later, in 1993, the FBI took over a massive siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. After a 51-day standoff, the Bureau utilized armored vehicles to inject tear gas into the complex. The compound caught fire, resulting in the deaths of 76 people, including many children.
These events were absolute public relations nightmares. They deeply scarred the agency's reputation and served as major rallying cries for the rising tide of domestic anti-government extremism. And the controversies just kept coming.
They really did.
The FBI faced heavy criticism over their aggressive and ultimately incorrect investigation of Richard Jewell, the security guard wrongly suspected of planting the bomb during the 1996 Centennial Olympic Park bombing in Atlanta.
And capping off this turbulent decade was a devastating internal blow. The revelation that Robert Hansen, a senior FBI counterintelligence agent, had been committing deep-cover espionage for the Soviet Union and Russia for over 2 decades from right inside the Bureau.
It must have destroyed morale.
It shattered the agency's confidence in its own internal security protocols.
The 1990s present a severe historical whiplash. I struggle to understand how an agency can simultaneously achieve incredible scientific milestones in the laboratory, successfully prosecute international terrorists, and yet suffer such catastrophic operational and public relations failures in the field.
Well, the underlying issue was a structural mismatch between the Bureau's training and the reality of the threats they were facing. The FBI was fundamentally stretched too thin.
They were trying to do too much.
Exactly. They were still operating primarily as a traditional reactive law enforcement agency. Their agents were trained to investigate a crime after it happened, gather evidence, and present it in a courtroom. But they were increasingly facing unconventional threats, lone wolf extremists, armed religious cults, and decentralized terror cells.
Right, which requires a totally different approach.
Exactly. An agent trained to audit a mobster's tax returns is fundamentally ill-equipped to negotiate a paramilitary standoff with an apocalyptic cult.
They were applying a law enforcement paradigm to asymmetric warfare. And that reliance on a reactive law enforcement model meant they were somewhat ignoring the looming, unaddressed specter of mass casualty terrorism that was slowly building in the background throughout the decade.
And that specter eventually materialized into a reality that changed the course of human history. On September 4, 2001, Robert S. Mueller III took over as director of the FBI.
And the timing there is just chilling.
It is. Exactly 1 week later, the September 11 attacks occurred.
The attacks fundamentally changed the world, and they forced the FBI to undergo the most drastic evolution in its history. Director Mueller was summoned by President George W. Bush, and the president asked a direct, harrowing question. What is the FBI doing to prevent the next attack?
It wasn't about solving crimes anymore.
Right. The president didn't care how many convictions the FBI could secure after a building fell. He demanded to know how the Bureau was going to stop the building from falling in the first place.
This simple question sparked a massive institutional shift. The Bureau was mandated to transition from a reactive law enforcement agency into a proactive, threat-based, intelligence-led national security organization.
It is the difference between being an emergency room doctor waiting for the ambulance to arrive versus being an epidemiologist trying to stop the virus from mutating and spreading in the first place.
That's a great analogy.
The required skill sets, the metrics for success, and the daily operations are completely different. If you are an epidemiologist, a successful day means absolutely nothing happens.
Right, silence is a victory.
But for an FBI agent, whose entire career identity is tied to slapping cuffs on a suspect and getting a conviction in court, being told that success means gathering intelligence where nobody goes to jail is a massive psychological shift.
Managing that shift was an unprecedented challenge. To manage this evolution, the structural changes unfolded in 3 distinct phases: triage, search, and crystallization.
How do they even begin?
First, Mueller had to throw out the old rulebook. Historically, the FBI operated on a decentralized Office of Origin system. If a bank was robbed in Chicago, the Chicago field office ran the case autonomously, and headquarters in Washington just provided support.
So they were very independent.
They were. But Mueller scrapped that entirely for terrorism cases. Headquarters seized strict top-down control of all intelligence gathering.
They rapidly expanded their Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs, growing them from 35 locations to over 100. They brought local and state officers into federal offices to share intelligence in real time.
They had to break down the silos.
Right. They established the Directorate of Intelligence and mandated that field intelligence groups be placed in every single office across the country, effectively doubling the number of agents dedicated solely to counterterrorism.
And here's a fascinating insight drawn from management theory analyzing this specific pivot. Management researchers discovered that the FBI's design, meaning its organizational structure, its written rules, and its task allocation, was much more flexible than its identity.
Because the identity was so entrenched.
Exactly. The identity was deeply culturally rooted in the ethos of being reactive criminal investigators. Mueller and his team realized they could not wait for the culture to change before addressing the threat.
So they just forced it.
They forced the structural changes first. They mandated top-down intelligence work, reassigned agents by fiat, and allowed the professional identity of the workforce to slowly catch up to the new reality over the next decade.
The agency survived the transition. The ER doctors learned how to become epidemiologists. This brings us into the modern era, from the 2010s through to the present day.
A very different landscape now.
It really is. And once again, I must clearly state to you, the listener, that we are now going to discuss recent, highly polarized events. We are impartially reporting the contemporary controversies exactly as they are detailed in the source material. We are not taking sides or validating political narratives. We are examining these events strictly to understand the immense modern pressures and scrutiny weighing on the Bureau today.
The modern FBI, operating under Director Christopher Wray, commands a budget soaring past $11 billion. The threat matrix has shifted heavily into the digital realm, with state-sponsored cyber threats emerging as a primary existential focus.
Cyber is the new frontier.
It is. A prime example of this new battlefield is the FBI's massive investigation into the 2020 SolarWinds supply chain compromise.
The mechanics of a supply chain attack are insidious. Can you explain how this specific compromise worked?
Instead of trying to directly hack into heavily fortified government servers, Russian state actors compromised a third-party software vendor named SolarWinds.
They went after the supplier.
Right. They inserted malicious code into a routine, seemingly legitimate software update. When government agencies and Fortune 500 companies downloaded the update, they unknowingly installed a backdoor into their own networks.
So the companies basically hacked themselves without knowing it.
Exactly. The FBI had to coordinate a massive private-public sector response to identify the intrusions and secure vast networks of compromised data. It demonstrated how borderless and complex modern investigations have become.
But alongside navigating the complexities of cyberspace, the FBI found itself navigating a deeply polarized, hyper-partisan political landscape. The Bureau has been at the center of intense contemporary controversies that have tested its institutional credibility.
The political pressure is immense.
The sources detail the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. This was the FBI's counterintelligence probe into potential coordination between the 2016 Trump campaign and the Russian government.
The fallout from that investigation resulted in intense scrutiny of the Bureau's internal mechanisms. A 2019 Inspector General report reviewed the FBI's actions and noted 17 significant inaccuracies and omissions in the FISA application used to secure wiretaps on former campaign aide Carter Page.
That is a lot of inaccuracies for a FISA warrant.
It is. Furthermore, Special Counsel John Durham's subsequent report cited severe confirmation bias within the Bureau. The report noted a failure by investigators to properly corroborate intelligence, specifically the Steele dossier, and concluded there was a lack of sufficient predicate to open a full investigation in the manner they did.
And the political pressure continued. Following the January 6 Capitol breach, the FBI undertook one of the largest, most expansive investigations in American history.
The scale of evidence they had to sift through was staggering.
They utilized massive amounts of digital evidence, cell phone geolocation data, social media posts, and facial recognition, resulting in over 1,500 federal charges, primarily for assault, property damage, and interference with law enforcement. Each of these massive, politically sensitive investigations places the FBI under a microscope of intense partisan critique from across the political spectrum.
And the scrutiny is not limited to politics. It extends to the profound ethical dilemmas generated by the digital age. The sources discuss a highly controversial operation known as Operation Pacifier.
The mechanism of this operation is deeply unsettling. To track down predators on the dark web, the FBI seized control of a child pornography server. But rather than immediately shutting it down, the Bureau actually operated the illicit site for a period of 2 weeks.
They kept it running.
Right. They deployed a network investigative technique, essentially a piece of malware, to unmask the IP addresses of the users visiting the site.
The operation resulted in hundreds of arrests, but it drew heavy, sustained criticism regarding the ethics of the state. Critics argue that the government distributing illicit, exploitative material, even temporarily to catch criminals, was a fundamental breach of ethical law enforcement.
It is a very difficult line to walk.
It is. There is also ongoing, widespread criticism regarding the FBI's ubiquitous use of digital surveillance. Watchdog groups frequently highlight instances of agents making unauthorized, improper searches within massive aggregated intelligence databases, querying the communications of American citizens without proper justification.
It forces us to ask a difficult question. Has the FBI simply traded its old Hoover-era controversies for new, digital ones?
It is a valid comparison.
In the 1960s, agents were picking locks to plant microphones in hotels. Today, they are deploying malware on servers and querying massive data streams. Are the tools completely different, but the fundamental friction between state power and individual privacy exactly the same?
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question regarding the survival of democratic institutions in our modern era. Is there an inherent unsolvable tension between maintaining a massive, highly effective intelligence apparatus required to protect a nation from catastrophic threats and sustaining public trust in a highly polarized, hyper-connected democracy.
That is the big question.
It really is. The FBI must possess the technological power and surveillance capacity to stop sophisticated cyber attacks and decentralized terrorism. But the very existence of that power inherently terrifies the public it is sworn to protect.
It is a dizzying evolution to contemplate. We started this deep dive looking at 34 investigators in 1908, desperately trying to figure out how to stop land fraud in the timber forests of Oregon.
And look where we are now.
We watched them invent the archetype of the G-Man to fight mobile gangsters during the Depression. We saw them pivot to hunting Soviet spies, using cryptography during the Cold War, survive the exposure of their own domestic abuses in COINTELPRO, legally dismantle the structural hierarchy of the mafia using the RICO Act, and completely reinvent themselves after September 11 into a sprawling, proactive counterterrorism and cyber force.
They have not just policed the United States. They have been a mirror reflecting the anxieties, the biases, and the ambitions of the nation for over a century.
And that leaves us with a final lingering thought to consider as we look to the future. As technology rapidly advances into the realm of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and predictive algorithms, will the FBI's next evolution look less like human investigators knocking on doors to ask questions, and more like an omnipresent, silent data processor analyzing our digital lives to predict crimes before they happen? And if that is the future, how does a free society effectively govern an agency that possesses the technological capacity to know absolutely everything? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.